Stop moving! A rather tall, crimson-haired, and dark gray-skinned Tari doctor snarled in agitation as she poked and prodded Rocket's body. Rocket wanted to, but the fact that the crabby woman shoved his corporal out of the room and started forcibly stripping him was distressing. Dr. Tulia, do we really need to do this? It was only vomit! Rocket half yelled in distress. Dr. Tulia's face contorted into a snarl. Her sharp canines intimidated the poor Uvil. You are far from recovered and decided not only to leave the MTF, but go adventuring! Tulia's harsh tone seemed to lash Rocket and made him recoil. With the help of her nurses, they forced Rocket's good hand from his groin and strapped him down to the medical table. Now, you are going to be obedient, and you're going to be scanned, or Emperor help me, for not even he will save you! Tulia barked down. Outnumbered and outarmed, Rocket had no choice but to yield to the infuriated Tari and her legion of nurses. He just wished it hadn't cost him his dignity. The scanning process always left him feeling uneasy. The whine of the machine, the sporadic lights, and the little needle sensations all over his body. It was little over an hour of what seemed like mental torture. The entire medical staff deemed it imperative to give him a full medical examination, and they were quite grabby in indecent spots. Even if it was purely professional, he still felt like he wanted to die. They didn't even have the decency to allow him to put his undergarments on himself. As Rocket was being wheeled out of the room, he noticed a shadow immediately shoot up from the ground. Is he okay? Elataria asked in a worried tone. Tulia seemed to give her the stink eye and looked her up and down. Surprisingly, yes, given the fact you misinterpreted fresh air as exploring the entire base, she said in a cold tone. Elataria shifted uncomfortably, still standing at attention. The doctor held her glare for a few moments longer before finally letting loose a sigh. Understanding it wasn't the poor corporal's decision or choice, Tulia let up her optical attacks. Next time, I expect you to dissuade the good lieutenant from deciding to go on unnecessary adventures, she said while wheeling the Uvil to Elataria. Yes, ma'am. Elataria immediately saluted. Giving one more sigh, Tulia looked at the rest of her staff and then towards Rocket. She then let go of the wheelchair, traded places with Elataria, and looked Rocket in the eye. Lord Zolnak, I've read your updated file, she said flippantly. Rocket's eye hardened as he shot his head to return the doctor's glare. It seems you've been transferred to a human unit, and they're transferring you to the human MTF, she said while brushing her hair over her ear. Elataria's eyes wiggled as she tried to keep a straight face. However, it's still my duty to see you are safely recovering while I still have you, Tulia said, letting go of the wheelchair. So it would be appreciated if you would make both of our lives easier. She stepped towards her staff and spun around. Rocket gave her a half-annoyed look. Imperial doctors were always difficult to deal with. They had a near-fanatical devotion to their craft and oaths. I'll be fine, Dr. Tulia. The humans won't kill me. Dr. Tulia's face scrunched in a cringe and immediately opened her mouth ready to retort. Yet, Rocket added before the words left her mouth. She closed her mouth and reevaluated the Uvil with a renewed curiosity. Rocket didn't like the way it seemed she was nearly dissecting him with her eyes. I would be careful with humans. They're the plotting types, she said, still studying him. He tried his best not to roll his eye. He didn't want to be lectured by someone who didn't have any first-hand experience with humans. Oh, don't give me that look. My husband is human, so I have at least a basic understanding of how secretive and conniving they can be. She put her hands on her hips. Rocket's eyebrows raised in surprise. He knew about the famous Tauri Duke and human scientist's relationship, but he thought that was an isolated political stunt. He never would have thought that Tauris and humans were actually interested in courting each other. Really? How are they? Elataria curiously spoke up from behind Rocket. He snapped his head up, getting ready to scold the improper corporal when Tulia spoke up first. Oh, I highly recommend it, she said gleefully. Rocket snapped his head between the two women in shock. I've had a few courtships with our males over the years, but the humans are an acquired taste, the doctor said as she ran her fingers through her hair. Elataria put her finger to her chin and thought. Once you get used to how Affectionate and touchy they are. You'll either love it or hate it. Tulia's hair fell down, strand by strand, as she slowly lifted her arm. Funnily enough, the nurses behind the doctor also seemed to be very interested in the conversation. Horror gripped Rocket as he realized what was happening. "Emperor, preserve me," he muttered to himself. He was stuck in the middle of a group of women gossiping. "What did you have to do to get him?" A nurse spoke up from behind her with genuine interest. Rocket rolled his eye and Tulia giggled as she looked over his shoulder at the gaggle of women behind her. "Absolutely nothing. He pursued me," she answered slowly with a smug grin. "Ooh, oh. The group burst into a surprised and almost argumentative muttering. "Dr. Tulia, please elaborate," Eletaria yelled to the dismay of Rocket. The poor Uvil was shaken around in his wheelchair, almost violently, by the excited corporal. "Maybe this is how I die," he thought to himself. He flattened his ears in hopes to drown out this horrible conversation. However, fate is a cruel mistress. "Oh, he was a gentleman. After a medical seminar, he walked up to me, declared I was beautiful, and would like to take the time to get to know me more." Tulia started gloating gleefully as she started going into detail about their encounters. "Please, just kill me." Rocket pressed his good hand to his head, trying to suppress a headache. The conversation continued for the next 5 minutes, until someone finally went too far. "So, does he satisfy you?" a nurse asked apprehensively. "No," Rocket said aloud to no avail. A huge grin spread across Tulia's face as she slowly looked back at said nurse. "They are a pursuit-predation mammal. Their endurance is unmatched," she said almost evilly. "Please, no," he pleaded once more. The group ignored him as the women were ensnared by Tulia recounting her bedroom escapades. "He does things to me that a man would never dream of. It's as if humans don't have the concept of shameful or degrading acts, like..." She continued to gush about her human husband to the gaggle of women. As the minutes dragged on, Rocket knew he was in hell, for he had no mouth and he had to scream. So many things he wished to never know. So many things he wished to scrub from his mind. It wasn't until Tulia received a notification on her datapad did everyone remember they were either still on duty or had somewhere else to be. "All right, ladies. We should have lunch sometime so I can get into the juicy parts," Tulia said, dismissing the group. "Juicy parts? As if earlier wasn't awful enough?" Rocket couldn't help but yell out in disbelief. The group finally noticed that he in fact existed, and turned their heads to him as if shocked he was there. Dr. Tulia walked away laughing, and Eletaria looked down at her disgruntled lieutenant with guilt on her face. Sir," she eked out before Rocket interrupted her. Just take me to my room," he said with his hand still pressed against his head. The headache was almost unbearable. "Yes, sir," she replied in half shame and half amusement. When he finally reached his room, he rested his weary head and worked on purging his mind of those foul memories. Sanctuary. "All right, sir. Just notify me or Liliandra if you need anything," Eletaria said as she was leaving the room. Rocket slowly rolled his head to look in the direction of her voice. "Yeah, I will. Thanks," he mumbled just loud enough for Eletaria to hear. She smiled wryly and let out a huff of amusement as she slowly closed the door. The next day was much more exciting. Liliandra accompanied him this time, and unfortunately she wanted confirmation on the details of yesterday's gossip that involved her friend. Rocket sat in the examination room, trying to drown out the continued gossip and endure the injection of tailored stem cells. Again, he wished for death to take him, when a series of loud knocks startled everyone inside. "Madame Tulia," a voice spoke from the other side of the door. "Yes?" Tulia spoke with an apprehensive curiosity. The door opened to show a pair of human MPs, military police, on the other side. Rocket was well acquainted with one of them, the tall, fair-skinned man with features similar to Jin. "Dale?" Rocket's lone eye opened in surprise. "We're here for Lieutenant—" "Oh, shit!" Dale was immediately cut off by a cup rocketing directly at his face. Thunk! The lucky man managed to immediately close the door, just before the object slammed into his face. "Emperor, damned humans and their reaction time!" Tullius snarled at the door. The door gingerly cracked open with just an eye peering through it to see if it was still safe. "We agreed the good lieutenant would be here for treatment for at least another week," she protested. "Madame, I'm sorry, but..." Dale tried his best to temper the hot-headed medical expert, but he was destined for failure. "Don't madame me!" The doctor roared while throwing another nearby object at the door. The door immediately slammed shut again. Clank! Ding! "He's not even remotely healthy enough for whatever you have planned!" she yelled with blind fury. The humans didn't even bother to open the door again. They decided having this conversation with a barrier between them was much safer. "Madame, I'm sorry, but we have strict orders to take him to the..." The same human voice tried to get out, but again he was cut off. Crash! Another object slammed against the door. "His nerves, let alone his muscles, haven't properly grown back yet, and you expect him to perform whatever psychotic duties you have in store?" Tullius sneered. "Aren't you supposed to be a healer? Everything you've thrown at us would have put us in a hospital!" Dale yelled through the door. The pair of humans then heard a pair of feet stomping in the direction of the door. "And you two would be guarded jealously until you are fully healed!" Tullia yelled as she approached the door. The two looked at each other and made the decision to pull on the door handle to prevent the angered woman from opening it. The door shook firmly at the start, and then started to rock violently. "Open the door, you cowards!" The howls from the other side of the door made sure that was not going to happen. The two pulled together to keep the monster at bay. "Fuck, Taria's strong as shit!" Dale sneered as he held on with all his might. "Somehow Imperial Doctor's even more psychotic than ours," Dale's partner mumbled, pulling to secure the door as well. Liliandra and Rocket stood there in mute horror and shock at the ferocity of their doctor. Rocket knew what Imperial healers' oaths entailed, and what they did to adhere to them, but to see it in action was breathtaking. Dr. Tullia, maybe we should hear them out?" Liliandra nervously asked. The doctor snapped her head back at her and glared. Her red irises seemed to be blazing with anger. "Eep!" Liliandra immediately shut up and looked away. "Madame, please, we promise he won't be exerted in any way," and immediately returned. Tullia's hand slammed down on the door. "Liars! I know you humans! You come with honeyed words, and when you're offered a small morsel, you eat a feast!" she bellowed. The doctor snarled in anger and pulled out her datapad. Her face contorted in even more anger as she answered the voice comm. "You bastard! You send your men to take a critically injured patient that can't even walk, and you expect me to just allow this to happen?" She screamed at her datapad while walking into the middle of the room. The door slightly opened again, and two cautious heads poked through to see what was happening. The doctor was flailing one of her arms and held the datapad in her other as she screamed into her earpiece. "No! No! I don't believe you!" she yelled. Everyone was hoping whoever was on the other side was trying to speak reason into her. For all they knew, all of their lives were in jeopardy. "You won't be able to speak your honeyed words and get your way this time! I said no!" She still remained angry, but the noise level slowly calmed down. She then abruptly stopped and stayed quiet for a while. Her eyes twitched periodically and her snarl started fading from unadulterated rage to mere anger. "Emperor bless whoever is speaking sense into her," Rocket mumbled quietly and Liliandra nodded eagerly. Dr. Tullia then stopped and gave a contemplative look. They could hear a voice coming from her earpiece, but no one understood the context. "You can't guarantee that! You won't be there yourself!" she said with less power from before. Silence and anxiety gripped the room as they watched the doctor. Her expression slowly softened, and her foot tapping. "Are you sure?" she asked almost gently. "Promise me you'll be there," she demanded. Dr. Tullia's expression finally softened, and she looked down at the ground. "Okay," she said, cooling down from her earlier rage. The room held their breath as they watched the rampaging woman start to calm down. No, I believe you, Tulia said softly. Okay. She gave another meek confirmation. There was a long pause with the doctor's face going from subdued to flustered panic. Her eyes darted around the room, trying to count how many people were there. She stuttered. Tulia's head looked like it was going to pop due to blood pressure. I love you too. The doctor's face fully flushed as he stumbled to get those words out. The two humans finally opened the door and gingerly stepped through, but immediately stiffened up at the renewed glare by the doctor. Hurry up and do whatever it is you're going to do, Tulia said, leaving the room out of sheer embarrassment. And bring him back! She shouted before storming off. The entire room sighed in relief. The storm seemed to have passed. Rocket turned his head to look at Dale, who seemed defeated and exhausted from the encounter. So, what are you doing here, Dale? Why do they want me? Rocket asked curiously. Dale shrugged. Fuck if I know, man. I'm just an MP. They want me to take you to the spooks, he said. Liliandra gently helped Rocket put his bad arm back into his sling, and then immediately took position behind his wheelchair. I'm not even allowed to get near that part of the base. We're taking you to a pickup location, Dale apologetically said as he rubbed the back of his head. Rocket rubbed his chin in thought. Well, there's only one way to find out, he said. Making their way through the base in a human light utility vehicle, Rocket leaned his head against the reinforced glass. He saw a group of humans and a lone female Tauri laughing around a table on a recreational bench while eating. When were humans allowed to roam this side of the base? Liliandra asked, befuddled. The vehicle somehow became even more silent than it already was. Dale seemed stumped for an answer when his partner saved him. Special qualified tasking. Don't worry about it, his partner said. Dale secretly gave him a thumbs up and turned around to face the two. Yeah, we don't know much about the program, so make sure you keep it to yourself, okay? He said with feigned bravado. Rocket smelled bullshit, and it stunk real bad. He wanted to say something, but he realized it really wasn't his problem. Okay, Liliandra said and looked to Rocket for answers. Rocket looked at her with a wry smile and shrugged. Humans are weird. Don't worry about it, he said to get her off topic. It was obvious whatever the humans in the recreational area were up to was trouble, and he knew the two in front were in on it. But again, it really wasn't his problem. Whatever, Liliandra said with a shrug of her own as she went back to staring outside. As they drove up on the human side of the joint base, they saw it was completely abuzz with activity, much more so than yesterday. The sheer amount of blacked-out VTOLs and the heavily armed human gunships that were flying in and out concerned Rocket a little bit. Something seemed to have happened, or something was happening. When the vehicle finally came to a stop, Rocket immediately recognized a familiar face that made him slightly cringe. Colonel Toivonen and another human. It seemed that she still held that motherly expression on her face, although that expression contorted into disgust and panic when Rocket vomited all over her. Just remembering was painful. He also noticed she was flanked by humans that screamed dangerous to him. They were armed to the teeth and seemed to have more cybernetics than he'd ever seen on a human. It was a subtle touch that made it look like their real body, but Uville eyes don't lie. The extremely small details of artificial skin and lines, where flesh meets machine. What troubled him the most were their faces. They were unnerving. He couldn't focus on them. It was as if his eyes naturally wanted to gloss over and ignore it. When he could focus, they seemed almost distorted. There! What the hell was that? Rocket noticed out of the periphery, more of them in key areas, forming a protective bubble. How the fuck? He muttered to himself. He jumped when his focus was interrupted by Liliandra opening his door with his wheelchair ready. As he was wheeled to the good colonel, she gave him a genuine smile. Ah, Rocket, I'm glad you could make it, she said happily. As Rocket was being pushed, he meekly waved his good hand. Good afternoon, Colonel. I'm sorry about yesterday, he said with painful embarrassment. The woman burst with laughter. Don't worry about it. I was the one worried, you know, Toivonen said casually. She also remembered how he chunked all over her. She was more afraid that she pushed too hard, but she was relieved he seemed to be perfectly fine. Anyways, I'd like you to meet Dr. Greco, she cheerfully introduced her compatriot. Hello, I'm Dr. Stefano Greco. I hope you don't mind me tagging along, Greco said with a smile. Liliandra immediately recognized him from the Tullia tales. You're Dr. Tullia's husband, she seemingly shouted. Dr. Greco scratched the back of his head and laughed nervously. Yeah, I apologize for the earlier scene. She takes her oaths very seriously, he replied. She is a wonderful woman, though. She cares deeply for every one of her patients. Greco finished with a love-struck smile. Is it true that you, Liliandra's curiosity got the better of her before she was cut off. Ahem! Rocket cleared his throat loudly, causing Liliandra to shut up. It's good to meet you too, Dr. Greco. Rocket returned the greeting. Well, now that introductions are done, he'll be overseeing your health as you perform... She stopped and eyed Liliandra and the MPs behind Rocket. Critical duties for us, she finished. Rocket understood and looked behind him towards Liliandra. I'm sorry, but I don't think they'll allow you to come with me, he said apologetically to her. Liliandra gave him a winning smile and waved her hand. Don't worry about it, sir. Shall I wait here? She tried to ease his troubles. How was he going to get back? He wondered. Oh, don't worry. We'll drop you off at the hospital at 1900 sharp. Dr. Greco spoke up this time. Toivonen gave him a sideways glare. I did promise, after all. Unless you want to fight an enraged Imperial medical practitioner, he said in a mocking tone while shrugging his shoulders. Giving in, Toivonen sighed as she turned around and walked towards a pair of vehicles. Fine, we need to work fast then, she said, her hand lifted daintily in the air and motioned everyone to follow her. Rocket's instincts screamed at him as he barely registered movements on his periphery. These humans, they moved like ghosts. The doctor got behind him and started pushing his wheelchair and caught up with the colonel. Rocket was looking around as subtly as he could, but the colonel seemed to notice. Don't mind the hands. They're here for security, she said, jarring him out of his search. What? Is security for what? We're in the middle of the most fortified base on the continent. Rocket was bewildered by what exactly they needed protection from. Not personal security. Operational. You'll understand when we arrive, Toivonen said, getting into the vehicle. Rocket's eyebrow twitched. What the hell was with humans and their emperor-damned secrets? He looked at Dr. Greco to see if he had any insight as to what was going on. Don't look at me. I'm only here because my wife asked me to be here. Greco shrugged with a wry smile on his face. He figured it was no use to argue. He'd just have to see for himself. They drove past checkpoint after checkpoint, each one more heavily fortified than the last, with more complex requirements for entry. Finally, they reached their destination, a moderately sized building made of an odd black and reflective material. Inside were some of the most paranoid security requirements he had ever encountered. They had to empty their pockets, be patted down, go through a scanner, remove their boots, give retinal scans, facial scans. The list went on, for verification of their identities. The doctor was stopped immediately by the ridiculously armed security teams. Sorry, sir, you're not authorized to pass, said a soldier in full exoskeleton armor. Ah, here! He pulled out an encrypted datapad and scanned it, then showed it to the soldier. At the same time, Toivonen pulled out a similar encrypted datapad and handed it over. He's given temporary access, she said with a hint of annoyance in her voice. Rocket's anxiety jumped massively at the fact that they wouldn't let their own doctor through, and the colonel couldn't just wave him in. Just what the hell were they hiding here? When they finally got through the security screening, they started walking down a long and narrow corridor. They finally entered a room at the end of the hallway. Inside was a group of humans sitting at a table, with a variety of monitors and instruments. On the wall, it looked like there was supposed to be a window there, but it was completely blacked out. Toivonen turned around to look at the two. Under no circumstances must you repeat or describe anything you've seen here, she said in a harsh and serious manner. Rocket wondered what the fuck he was getting himself into. Well, it's not like he had a choice in the matter. He signed up for it. "Roger that, ma'am," he said crisply. The colonel nodded at him and returned to Dr. Greco. "This goes double for you, Doctor. You're here as a courtesy because you made this happen," she continued. "Failure to comply will result in your arrest and punishment under UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. This comes straight from MISO Command." She gave him a threatening glare. Dr. Greco shifted nervously. I got it. I'll keep my mouth shut," he said, understanding how serious this was. Toivonen nodded with satisfaction, then walked towards the wall and tapped a button. The section of the wall that was blacked out immediately went transparent, and what was inside shook Rocket to his core. A lone Scourge was laying on a bed, sleeping comfortably. It was the very same one he helped capture. But what disturbed him more was what was next to her. Dozens of eggs. Eggs with red stripes. "You must destroy them!"